it is the common denominator of humanity. Since we're talking about identity politics, I should probably talk about diversity a little bit. Steve mentioned the Barbra Streisand thing, which I normally have to bring up, so I'm grateful for that. It's really the high mark of my career. When Hillary Clinton, she just didn't cancel her subscription. She wrote this fantastic open letter to the Southern California community, just beating the hell out of me, right? And it read like, one of those letters I get from guys in prison who've like memorized the thesaurus but don't exactly know what all the words mean. And so she had this thing about how replacing Robert Scheer, who is a widely respected, time-honored left-wing columnist, very left-wing columnist, and a very good friend of Barbra Streisand's. In fact, he was sort of her political tutor for a while. That replacing Robert Scheer with Jonah Goldberg, her phrase was diluted the gamut of diversity in American life, or diluted the gamut of voices, and was bad for diversity. And she says it over and over, and bad for diversity. And the thing is that, look, ethnographically, I don't know what you would call it, biologically, all I am is like a younger version of the exact same thing Robert Scheer is. Descendant of European Jews, white guy, both from New York City, right? So in terms of the diversity that normally scores with people, different colors, different genders, different sexes, all that kind of stuff, we are exactly the same. The difference is that I actually bring a completely different worldview, both than Robert Scheer's column, but also basically to that op-ed page. And for her, that means there's less diversity, not more diversity. And you find this all over the place, where diversity has basically come to mean, it's like when they talk about Bill Clinton's cabinet looking like America. What they meant by that was 17 lawyers who come in different shapes, sizes, and colors, and who all think the exact same way. And so but there's a larger problem with diversity. First of all, it is not true that diversity is always good. Diversity is sometimes good. A diverse stock portfolio is better than one that just everything's in Twitter, right? Steel is stronger than iron because it's an alloy and it has different ingredients to it. The NBA is clearly, as Jesse Jackson always likes to say, is a much better league because black people are finally allowed to play in it. That's all true. But the NBA wouldn't be better if all of a sudden you had to have a quota of 10% of every team have to be midgets, right? No one would talk about how the NAACP has to accept Klansmen. The simple fact is that diversity, it depends what you're talking about. And yet, invariably, and that's the problem, is that the left only really means one kind of diversity. A kind of a diversity that says, give voices and power to the people that we want to have speak, and deny voices and power to everybody else. And that is my problem with it. To me, the only interesting kind of diversity is a diversity of perspectives. But you have African American civil rights leaders who do a lot of good work, but they're also out there at the same time saying that Clarence Thomas doesn't count as a black man, right? Or I remember the New York Times had this fascinating book review of the history of the Klan, which is a fascinating history, especially the second Klan, the one that comes in the 1920s, which is basically a movie cult for Birth of a Nation, the way guys dressed up in Darth Vader outfits were for Star Wars, right? And the Democratic Party was basically the political wing of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. And the author, with all the academic verbiage, says essentially that there's an irreducible amount of racism in America that bubbles up in unexpected places. And he says today you can find it most in places like Herman Cain being so popular with the Tea Parties. Now, we are through the looking glass if you think that an Southern African American guy being the leader of, from Georgia, being the hero of the Tea Party movement, and that's proof the Klan is alive and well, right? I mean, there's just some weird logic going on there. In a lot of ways, I think Ron Burgundy got it right. Ron Burgundy is, so after Joss Whedon, he's my hero. He's from the movie Anchorman, and when they talked about bringing Veronica Corningstone into the newsroom, bringing a woman onto the news team, he said, he's asked, do you know what a diversity is? And he says, well, I could be wrong, but I believe diversity is an old wooden ship that was used during the Civil War. But keep in mind, he said, I could be wrong. So the same thing goes with dissent, right? I mean, dissent during the Bush era, and for the record, I was not an enormous George Bush fan. During the Bush era, we heard constantly that dissent is the highest form of patriotism. Now, dissent is basically like the lowest form of racism, right? Like if you disagree with Barack Obama, it has to be because you're racist. Cindy Sheehan had, according to Maureen Dowd, absolute moral authority because her son was tragically killed in Iraq, right? Even though most of the rest of her family were not supportive of Code Pink and all that stuff, she had absolute moral authority because of what happened with her and her son tragically losing his life. But you listen to the mainstream media these days, who glorified Cindy Sheehan and turned her into something of a dashboard saint. You try to get them to pay any attention to, say, the families of the people who were killed in Benghazi, or the border guard who was killed because of the Fast and Furious program. And they're treated as just Fox News cranks that don't need to be listened to. Because, again, dissent is something that only the right people are supposed to be doing. And when the wrong people are doing, it's scary. It's the return of dangerous and extremists and all that kind of stuff. You know, Occupy Wall Street got the most amazing press coverage for any group of people who think it's okay to recycle your urine and defecate on police cars I could ever have imagined. They left absolute wreckage wherever they went and were treated as heroes and the voice of youth, because this whole idea is that young people are supposed to be left-wing, and so the mainstream media, a lot of them are so these aging baby boomers are nostalgic for the 1960s, and they just went nuts for them. Meanwhile, the Tea Partiers have been treated, I mean, if once 100 times, as essentially, one scratch of the cheek away from finding a Nazi underneath. And you just can't have it, they're like, they're two holes in a pillowcase from being a Klansman. And the double standard is simply astounding. My friend and colleague at National Review, John O'Sullivan, he once had this great line where he said, taking sort of the dissent stuff to the extreme, he said, people say dissent is the highest form of patriotism. Well, treason is the highest form of dissent. Therefore, treason is the highest form of patriotism, right? And the simple fact is, dissent was never the highest form of patriotism. This idea that dissent in and of itself is a wonderful and good thing is ridiculous. Dissent, absent a context, the dissent for its own sake, isn't patriotic, it's asininity. I mean, try to get something done, and there's one guy in the room who, just for the sake of objecting, objects all the time. He's not a hero, he's an idiot. So, should I start winding this stuff? Okay, so the cliche that I think is most relevant to the political times that we live in right now is cliches having to do with community. Barack Obama sincerely believes this, liberals sincerely believe this, that there are that the best arguments for what they want to do revolve around this idea of community, this idea of us all working together. Barack Obama, when he was asked to summarize his political philosophy, said that this idea that we are our brother's keeper, we are our sister's keeper. The first problem is that the only place the phrase "our brother's keeper" shows up in the Bible is when one brother is trying to dodge the murder rap for the other brother. Second of all, I went through the Oxford English Dictionary when I was trying to study this stuff. I mean, shocking as it may be, I'm not a Christian theologian, but the word keeper in and of itself is, it basically means like zookeeper, right? And the idea that somehow the head of our federal government is talking about his political philosophy is driven by the idea we're all each other's keepers creeps me out a little bit. But he says other things, government is us. Government is government is just another word for those things that we do together. The Democratic Convention in 2012, which I attended, again for reasons of having to do with original sin, it began with a video that said, "Government is the one thing we all belong to." Now, as a sort of Tea Party-ish kind of guy, that makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle, because it's, I guarantee, please, who's ever here from the student newspaper, I did not just call for any assassinations, it's just a joke. But it's but it gets at a serious point. The idea that we belong to government completely inverts the idea of the Founding Fathers. The idea of the Founding Fathers was that we don't belong to the government belongs to us. We are citizens, not subjects. And we form government to do limited things as free men in association, but we reserve all those other rights to ourselves. Now the thing is, and this is not shocking, I am not the target audience for the Democratic Party's promotional videos. I mean, it's weird to hear, but it's true. And something that I think conservatives really need to think about is that the people who are targets for that hear something completely different. They don't hear tyranny is coming or any of that kind of stuff. They hear someone saying, join us, you can be part of something, right? Part of a cause larger than ourselves, which is a phrase I despise. And I don't despise it because I think it's not true. I think we all should be dedicated to causes larger than ourselves. I'm dedicated to plenty of causes larger than myself, and they'd have to be pretty large causes. My family, the places I work, my friends, your churches, your synagogues, your communities, bowling leagues, college yearbooks, sports teams. These are all causes larger than ourselves that we make sacrifices for because we love them. The thing is that when you hear politicians talk about we have to dedicate ourselves to causes larger than ourselves, they almost invariably are talking about government programs, paid volunteer enterprises, which I thought a paid volunteer was just a job. And they talk about it in terms of a relationship with government. And the simple fact is that that is not the way to think about causes larger than yourself. No one I know is undedicated to any causes, except for maybe Hannibal Lecter, right? And so, and the simple fact is that so many of the problems that we're facing in this country don't have actually that much to do with government. I mean, yeah, the deficit and the debt and all that kind of stuff, those are big problems, and Obamacare is a mess and all that kind of stuff. But from the conservative perspective, the reason why that appeal is attractive is because in the larger society, civil society is breaking down. The family is breaking down. Out-of-wedlock births are going through the roof. Some of it has to do with, some of them are Krugman-esque arguments about the changing nature of the economy. Some of them have to do with things that are more sympathetic to social conservatives. But the simple fact is, it's a real problem. And so I'm going to close with this one point about cliches that I think is vital.